When you look at the tourists snapping photos of those giant digital billboards in Times Square, and then at the tourists strolling the rampart walkway of the Great Wall of China, you can't help but wonder how much those two images have in common.
I mean, as you study the wall carefully, the turrets, the crenellations, the massive sloping sides, the winding lines snaking over the mountains, you keep wondering, is it real? Is it fake? Actual fortifications from a remote past or some sort of pastiche? Something's definitely wrong here, but what? Maybe the whole thing is a hoax. Well, is it? First, let's get all those silly myths about the wall out of the way. It was never one long continuous structure. It was and is a patchy network of structures in various stages of disrepair. It was not built at once. Hadrian's Wall was built at once. Fenway Park was built at once. The Great Wall of China was not. It did not effectively stop invasions. Mongols and Manchus got through or around it pretty much at will. One gets the impression they never even noticed it except in passing. It is not an ancient, carefully preserved structure. Many laborers died while building it, that much is true. Harsh conditions, forced labor, conscription, but no credible evidence shows bodies used as construction material. No entombment in the brick, Verdi's Aida style. It is not uniform masonry, stone and brick. Most of it is rammed earth, wood, and reeds. It is not a purely military installation. It was used as a customs and taxation system and also for immigration control. It was not important to the Chinese as a national symbol from the start. That would be an embarrassingly recent cultural development. Chinese people were aware of it, yes, over the centuries, and did mention it in sorrow, lamenting the harsh treatment of folks who died building it. And no, it cannot be seen from space. People tried, to no avail.
No, I cannot see it. Xie.
Yes, the trustworthy experts at the European Space Agency issued a press release reporting on its visibility from an altitude of 100 and separately from 200 miles. But soon after, the image turned out to be a river in Beijing. So now, if you peel away the layers of pseudo-historical bullshit, the story of the Great Wall begins, sort of, with Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant who, at the age of 17, set out for China accompanied by his father and his uncle. And this is directly related to the Mongols. Bear with me. The Mongol Empire was vast, even though a lot of it was empty. At their peak, the Mongols were the most successful and the most ruthless warriors in history, frightened the hell out of everybody. They steamrolled Abbasid Caliphate, today's Iran, formerly Persia, Iraq, and significant portions of the Middle East and North Africa. They burned down Baghdad, the cultural center, along with its main library, known as the House of Wisdom, founded centuries prior and containing manuscripts from all over the known world, like Greek, Persian, Indian, and their translations into Arabic. This effectively ended the period known today as the Islamic Golden Age. The attack on Russian territories was almost equally horrendous, but all that said, very few Mongols actually lived on the territories they devastated, except China. China, with its fabled The Art of War manual full of ingenious strategies, tactics, and general philosophical wisdom, with their proto-firearms, which later inspired the extraterrestrial weaponry you could see in the movie Stargate, and the subsequent TV series, and the celebrated Great Wall. All of that fell to the Mongols in 3 stages. Following the final battle, the conquerors decided to stay and quickly formed a government. Thus, the Yuan dynasty was born. Their positive contribution to global civilization was the protection, rather effective, of the Great Silk Road. Highway robbers and invading posses were dealt with swiftly and mercilessly. You looked the wrong way at a merchant traveling on the Silk Road, you didn't last till morning. The Mongol elite valued trade. Their two capitals, Beijing in winter and Xanadu in summer, were shockingly wealthy, and they meant to keep them that way. Now, Marco Polo and his companions took advantage of that. The downside was that the Great Plague was carried along the Great Silk Road from China to Europe, killing half of its population, but that's a story for another day. Anyway, the trip took about 4 years. Once in China, young Marco began to absorb the local culture, learning enough Chinese to communicate, eating a lot of General Tso chicken. No, actually, General Tso chicken was invented in New York in the 1970s. The Mongol emperor named Kublai, or simply Kubla Khan, who was Genghis Khan's grandson. You'll recall Coleridge, right? In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. Kind of eerie, isn't it? The sunless sea part is like especially sinister. So yes, that Kubla Khan.
He was an inquisitive fellow who liked to learn about all kinds of things: foreign lands, wonders of the world, bordellos in Venice, etc.
What could Marco possibly tell him that would pique his interest? Let's see. Venice in the second half of the 12th century was already a merchant hub, an influential center. The impossible city already boasted St. Mark's Basilica, as Byzantine as they come, the Doge Palace, the Rialto Bridge, some early Gothic and late Romanesque structures. It was impressive by the era standards. Rome? Marco had never been there. Could he show Kubla some sketches? Maybe. Be that as it may, the Polos stayed in China for the next 17 years. How they made a living? Did Marco receive a pension from the emperor? Nobody knows for sure, but Marco seems to have bounced around the country extensively, gathering information, striking up conversations with locals over a cup of rice wine. In his account, he carefully avoids the question of female companionship, a strangely Victorian move. At the end of the 17 years, he was apparently still single. Courtesans and streetwalkers were common in China in those days, but we don't have enough data to speculate. What is known is that he, his father, and his uncle returned safely to Venice, and that very soon after his return, Marco took part in a battle against the Genoese. The Venetians were defeated. Marco was captured and put in prison. One of his cellmates was a professional romance writer, name of Rustichello da Pisa. Marco's stories about his sojourn in China drew his interest, so the two of them collaborated. Marco would talk, practically dictating the sporadically fascinating account of his travels, while Rustichello would write things down, adapting, correcting, augmenting, and so forth. This went on for a year. Both were eventually released from prison. Rustichello's wealthy patrons and Marco's equally wealthy family paid the ransom, one would think. Many parts of Marco's story seem to be embellished, exaggerated, or simply made up. Nonetheless, there was enough truth, enough authenticity, enough verisimilitude in his tale to draw the attention of scholars. The book gained limited notoriety. All copies were handwritten. This was before the invention of the printing press. Other parts, though truthful, were perceived as fantasy, such as burning black stones that give off heat. Okay, over in England, coal had been used since, Roman times, much to the disgust of Emperor Hadrian when he visited the place. But England back then was a backwoods country that no one was interested in. So the idea of fiery stones did come across as fake. Marco married a woman of noble birth. They had 3 daughters. Marco had a successful career as a merchant and died wealthy. Now here's the relevant part, the crucial part. Marco Polo never mentions the Great Wall in his story. Not once. 17 years, possible imperial patronage, traveling all over China specifically to gather information. No wall. As if it didn't exist. No wall. 17 years, no wall. 3 whole centuries passed. Portuguese shipbuilding improved significantly during that period. Heavily sponsored explorers and then enterprising merchants established a sea route to China. Before that, the Chinese finally had enough of Mongol rulers, and simultaneously the Mongol elite had become lazy and relaxed. Their grip on power weakened significantly. Coincidentally, a revolt occurred, following which the Mongols were expelled to the last man, and the Ming dynasty jumped into power. One of its early emperors built a fleet of Chinese ships. Fairly impressive despite being almost flat-bottomed, and organized 7 major voyages across the Indian Ocean. Those weren't exploratory trips, rather they were diplomatic missions, displays of power, trade networks. After 20 years of this maritime gaslighting, the dynasty put a lid on the project, retired the ships, and left the whole sea route business to the Portuguese. So missionaries followed merchants, taking the Vasco da Gama route around Africa, past the Cape of Good Hope, to Goa in India, and after a prolonged layover to Macau in China. Most were Jesuits, and many of those were tough, determined, highly dedicated people. They didn't ask questions like, if this project fails, who's going to reimburse me for this little excursion to China? They just went. A typical journey took anywhere from 1.5 to 3 years. Some say 4. Not everyone made it all the way to China. There were shipwrecks, pirate attacks, scurvy, and so forth. Ships did not travel year-round. Folks had to wait, sometimes for months, in various layover places. Some missionaries, upon reaching Goa, would just say, okay, I'm done here. I'm not cut out for this. I'm going back. Yes, but those who did press on reached Macau, a port the Portuguese were leasing from the Ming dynasty. Few people today can fully appreciate what a sea voyage was like back then. The ships were nothing like today's cruise ships with casinos and cabins resembling hotel rooms. They were a lot smaller and prone to being tossed around by the waves, heavy rolling and pitching non-stop. It was a nightmare. You could be a civilian or an experienced sailor, it was all the same. More than a week on firm dry land, in the first few days of the voyage, you'd be puking overboard and
unable to eat anything but hardtack,
which would be dry, bread-like substance you could easily break your teeth on, and maybe have a little water. Passengers were advised to spend as much time as possible lying down in their absurdly small compartments with their eyes shut for days until they finally got their sea legs, which is to say until their inner ear stopped panicking and could eat normal food, which was in short supply and as basic as possible. To move your bowels, you had to head for the bowl. There'd be a board with a hole in it. It was called the head. You had to hold on tight for dear life to relieve yourself straight into the sea naturally. Washing, in the form of sponge bathing, was minimal. Fresh water had to be conserved. It was beastly cold in winter and scorching hot in summer. And there were rats. And by the way, this kind of sea travel continued until the second half of the 19th century, when more advanced and much larger steamships began to appear. Some were actual passenger ships rather than just cargo tubs with a couple of cabins, compartments for travelers who weren't sailors. And yet, folks continued to cross oceans, including women, wives of diplomats and engineers and attaches and whatnot. The transatlantic and transpacific voyage, they were something one braced oneself for, something that just had to be endured. No one looked forward to that part of seeing the world. Those cabins, private compartments on or just below the main deck, those weren't for everyone either. Only like for respectable people with good credit rating. Less financially secure passengers had to travel in the hull with the rats. But I digress. Upon arriving in Macau, you'd have to wait for the Ming Dynasty's representative to grant you passage to the capital. You might as well wonder why did the emperor allow and even encourage this? Well, as I said earlier, a lot of the missionaries were Jesuits, and Jesuits were mathematicians, astronomers, cartographers. Some, like Matteo Ricci, became imperial advisors. Astronomy, especially determining the past dates and predicting future dates of eclipses, this was important to the rituals and therefore to the hierarchy, to the mischievous interpreters of Confucian order. Now, the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, the super enlightened monks, they were a thorough and largely fearless bunch. Rumor is they still are, and to this day, possibly the greatest and best educators in the world. Just ask a wealthy parent how easy it was to enroll their child in that Loyola school on Park Avenue. Freshman class, 40 to 50 seats per year. They don't publish their acceptance rates, but hey, I'd estimate 50 or so applicants per seat. Open to all denominations. The tuition is pretty steep. The particular Jesuit we're interested in here was called Matteo Ricci. He was in his early 30s when he arrived in China, so he probably looked something like this. Born in Italy, educated in Rome. The architecture of Rome in the 17th century, the Musketeer century, was already highly impressive. 800 years, give or take, after the fall of the western part of the empire, Rome was getting wealthy once again. Apart from the aqueducts, some of them still functional after centuries of neglect. Apart from those, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, St. Angelo's Castle, St. Angelo Bridge, St. Peter's Basilica, Piazza Navona, those were already there. Ricci mastered math, cartography, and Tychonic astronomy. He was a quick study. He could probably cook too. There were already Jesuit missions in China, but they were highly local enclaves. Proselytizing was rare and frowned upon by the powers that be. They perceived it as a threat to Confucian order. But the Jesuits' knowledge of math and astronomy was highly valued by Chinese scholars first and foremost, and also by the rulers. Ricci began by building a reputation for himself. He studied classical Chinese so diligently that by the end of his sojourn, he wrote scientific essays in that language. And those were in fact popular in Chinese scientific circles. He dressed as a Chinese scholar. He did not present himself as a Christian preacher at first, merely as a scientist with European roots. It took him years, but he was finally introduced to the court and to the emperor. He used instruments like astrolabes, armillary spheres, and quadrants, standard in Europe by that time, but apparently unheard of in China. He went by the Ptolemaic and Tychonic models of the solar system. He introduced the Chinese elite to the European-style calendar, essential at that moment for imperial legitimacy, and to modern cartography. The emperor was mighty impressed when Ricci showed him a world map. With his reputation established, Ricci could travel around the country freely, continue his studies, and eventually he felt he could build a church. And so he did. It wasn't much to look at. It wasn't a Baroque building, not yet. At the time, the Jesuits did not try to introduce Vitruvian architectural niceties to China, fearing they would stand out too much among all those pagodas. The chapels that did exist were repurposed Chinese vernacular structures. Ricci's church was a modest something or other. Later, well after his death, it was destroyed, rebuilt, burned down during political upheavals, rebuilt again, demolished when Christians were persecuted, and rebuilt once again. The current building is neo-Baroque, dating back to the year of our Lord 1903. Now, about the wall. Prior to the Mongol invasion, it seems to have consisted more or less entirely of rammed earth ramparts. Not very impressive. The Yuan dynasty, the Mongols, ignored those altogether. They favored mobile cavalry tactics, so like static walls were strategically unimportant to them. I mean, they practically begged folks to invade their territories. Like, please, come on in. You'll see what happens to you. The Ming dynasty was first to introduce some structure to border fortifications. Brick and some stone were used in selected spots. Coupled with the picturesque mountain scenery, a few sections did come to look impressive. And that's what Ricci reported in some detail, and the reports were conveyed all the way to Italy through the Jesuit network, and promptly forgotten. Ricci died in China and is buried there in Beijing. Another century passed. Jean-Baptiste Duhalde, a French Jesuit historian, geographer, and sinologist, expert on China, gathered all the missionary reports the Jesuits had collected by then and published his own account, in which he described the wall in colorful detail, even though he himself had never left Paris. His book was of great interest to specialists, but it didn't turn the wall, such as it was back then, into a Chinese national treasure. No one outside scholarly circles was really interested, least of all the Qing dynasty. The few brick and stone sections, the picturesque ones, had fallen into horrible disrepair. As a matter of fact, the government had given the locals the green light to scavenge, use the materials for their own needs. 2 more centuries passed. Finally, Mao's government began to pay attention, and Mao's successors launched the so-called Restoration Project, while UNESCO recognized the wall as a protected site. UNESCO stands for United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Here's what their headquarters building in Paris, built in 1958, looks like. Highly educational, wouldn't you say? Anyway, the restorers ran into problems from the start. Not engineering problems, but rather, commercial problems. Proper restoration, faithful preservation, authenticity, those would not work. The rammed earth ramparts aside, who in their right mind would want to travel great distances to look at those? But the permanent looking sections, the ones that had been neglected for centuries and were falling apart, were few and not particularly impressive either. Worse, they weren't walkable. I mean, where do you put the happy tourists? How do you even get them to it? I mean, the desirable sections are out of the way with no decent roads around. So decisions were made, some people were put in jail just in case, and the project took off. The sections with tourist potential were raised and widened to look more presentable. Modern construction methods were used: neat brickwork, neat lines, things you don't see in functional military installations of like any era. Steps were introduced on slopes for visitors' convenience. Crenellations and turrets were constructed that were hardly in keeping with the Ming Dynasty's style and expertise. Just look at those neat arched windows with neat cornerstones. All this was done only in the immediate proximity of urban centers visited by tourists. The rest of the network went untouched. The results looked kitschy and still do, but combined with the picturesque mountainside, the wall does impress you, like meandering over and around all those cliffs and elevations. So that was when not just romantically inclined foreigners, but actually the Chinese themselves suddenly became interested. The problem here isn't specifically a Chinese problem, far from it. It's today's global peril. Architects and engineers aren't trained to visualize harmony, never mind appreciate it. When asked to construct something historic, they copy details, sometimes very diligently, without really assessing the overall picture. Some of them do realize that the thing looks fake, but they just can't put their finger on it. Like, what's wrong? Where did we miscalculate? Like the notorious Thames Town, 30 miles out of Shanghai. They were given an assignment: build a town indistinguishable from an historic English town. They studied, they measured, they built it. At first glance, it looks like a reasonably good copy, a diligent student copying his master's work. Upon closer examination, of course it's fake. It's too repetitive, too neatly planned, not at all organic, and most important, it's not in keeping with the environment. England is up north. Shanghai is in the subtropics. Remember Vitruvius, father of architecture? Everything should speak to everything else, including the local climate and terrain.
Elizabethan built environment invites sunlight.
The more, the better, because there's never enough of it, while also guarding itself against the frequent drizzle, not subtropical storms. Imitating a Spanish town would have been a much better idea. In Spain, historic architecture is programmed to create shade, to shield people from the scorching sun. Did the designers think of that? Well, apparently not. In fact, a Mexican town would have been appropriate as well. Today's wall is a 20th century awkward fantasy on historic themes, rather than a genuine system of military fortifications from the past. A poorly polished Disneyland-type architectural performance. And pretty impressive, despite the clumsiness. Thank you for watching. I'm Ricky Vernier, coming to you from Brooklyn, New York, and I'll see you soon.